Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. Are you walking through something in a relationship or in a situation you have at work, or maybe something that has just been a curveball in your life that you don't really know how to walk through without some professional help? Well, if that is you, BetterHelp is here to help you. They sponsor this podcast. I myself have been helped by a BetterHelp therapist who I absolutely needed at a time in my life where I was working through some workplace abuse. And the things that she would say to me, give me to do in between our sessions that were weekly, just really transformed me. She walked me through some really, really hard things, and I've come out the other side with so much more freedom. And I just want to recommend it to you. There are professionals there that can help you walk through whatever it is, whether you're trying to figure out what's next for you, work through some tricky things in a relationship. Please check out betterhelp.com/difference for 10% off your first month. That's www.betterhelp.com/difference for 10% off your first month today. I'm excited to welcome my friend Lisa Sharon Harper onto the show today. Lisa is a founder and president of Freedom Road, a groundbreaking consulting group that crafts experiences that bring common understanding and common commitments that lead to common action toward a more just world. Lisa is a public theologian whose writing, speaking, activism, and training has sparked and fed the fires of Reformation or reformation in the church from Ferguson and Charlottesville here in the United States to South Africa, Brazil, Australia, and Ireland. Lisa's book, Fortune, How a Race Broke My Family and the World and How to Repair It All, was named one of the best books of 2022, and The Very Good Gospel was also named 2016 Book of the Year by Englewood Review of Books. Lisa is a board member of Justice Revival. We joined at the same time. It's a leading organization of the Faith for ERA campaign. She's also an Auburn Senior Fellow, and Lisa is also proud to join the inaugural cohort of the Aspen Institute Racial Justice and Religion Collective. The Huffington Post identified Lisa as one of 50 women religious leaders to celebrate on International Women's Day. Lisa's also a host of a podcast called the Freedom Road Podcast, and she's a co-host of The Four podcast as well. She's an author of her weekly column, The Truth Is, on Freedom Road Substack. And I'm excited to have this conversation with her today. Our friendship has revolved around being on a board together and being in board meetings and being on board retreats together in the DC area, some, car rides once in a while. But I'm excited to have her on the show today. If she's new to you, I'm really excited to introduce her to you because her work in the area of justice, some of the things she's doing around Gaza. She just got back from speaking in that area, and she's very active in the conversation around the political side for the United States citizens as we're involved in it, whether we're abroad or in the United States, but also just at the intersection of how politics intersects with people in religious spaces. She's really also just a historian by nature in terms of how she's really dug into history for her own family and to write these books. And currently, she's pursuing further studies over in Europe to learn more for herself and for us, because she's definitely going to be writing about it for us. So really excited to welcome Lisa onto the show today. So join me around the world to give a very warm welcome to my friend Lisa Sharon Harper. Lisa, it's so great to have you here on the podcast today. I know most of the time we interact, it's at a board retreat in DC or in a car ride where I'm taking you to a train station or some of our board meetings, but it's nice to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for showing up.
So true, Lori. So fabulous to be on your podcast. And I didn't even know you had one. And now I'm like on it. And, but I've just really enjoyed getting to know you. We're on this board together, everybody. And it's the Justice Revival, which is fabulous. It's amazing work done in the sphere of women's empowerment. And especially the thing I'm most excited about is the ERA campaign that we have going on. But I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But Lori, great to have you here. Great to be here.
Sorry. You're used to hosting.
I'm not the host.
Yeah. I know. I love interviewing podcast hosts because we're like, are we interviewing? Are we not? So we're just going to be that way today.
Please.
So fun.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But guess what? You get to be interviewed. So, and I have both of your amazing books here. We have The Very Good Gospel. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, I'm showing it on here. And then we have Fortune, which is your most recent one.
Thank you.
And I've already introduced you to the guests, but I'd love for you to share a little bit about kind of your personal journey. What led you to all the many hats that you wear? You're an author, you're a speaker, you're an activist. What was it in you, maybe as a little girl, as a young adult?
Mm.
What was it that kind of formed and birthed this who we see today, Lisa Sharon Harper?
Well, I mean, I'm a writer and an author, an activist and theologian. I think that a lot of that stretches back to my upbringing and my family who came before me. Family stories have always been a huge part of my bonding with my mom, how I bond with her, how she actually instilled confidence in me and also a sense of self, a sense of who I am by telling me who I am. And before ancestry.com and all of our genealogical work, we didn't really know. We more like had the general stories of we are from Africa, and we are from kings and queens. And we didn't know a whole lot. We just could go back as far as my grandpa, maybe to my great grandpa. She did know my great grandpa, like knew him and knew his name, but we didn't know any further than that. We had stories, but it was more like folklore. But now that we've done this research, the research that birthed the book Fortune, we know a whole lot more. And so, I mean, I would really have to say that why am I who I am? I am who I am because they were. And my On my father's side, it stretches back into the deep South, is where they came into America from Alabama, and then also New York, Alabama through my grandmother's side, New York through my grandfather's side. And before that, my grandfather was in Puerto Rico. And before Puerto Rico, St. Kitts Nevis. My grandmother, Jamaica and French and British Guyana. My mother's side goes way, way back here. I'm literally 10 generations to 1682 was the first ancestor who came to America from Belfast. Hello, somebody. To Belfast. And then 4 years later after that, the man that she had an affair with, who was my 11 times great grandfather, just really Sambo game, Gam, and likely from the Gambia River, he was boarded onto a death ship that they call a slave ship, and he made it to the shores of Maryland. So, I've done a lot of research. Fortune was a book that was all about researching the question of how did race break the world and my family. When we look at the different threads that weave their way, the themes that weave their way through my family story, themes of strength, themes of family estrangement, themes of writing, themes of artistry, dance. They all come from my ancestors. So I very much like stand on the ground that they created for me. I also am a person who found Jesus in an evangelical context in the 1983 in South Jersey in a Sunday evening camp church meeting. And so my whole theological thread of who I am in terms of as a theologian, it really stretches back to those moments when I met Jesus at that camp meeting, and also for the year before when I was really seeking. And all of the development and faith development after that. I was on staff with a Christian ministry for a decade, on college campuses. And, so a lot of my focus has been how to help the church to do justice more justly. And that's the work that Freedom Road does now.
Yeah, well, I mean, in reading your book and in knowing you, just as a friend and hearing your story, I remember when you talked about when we were in one of those board retreats in DC, just the splattering of your ancestors all around the Caribbean and understanding, that just the pain and the trauma of that history, which is very real. And you've helped us see it in such a eye-opening way, something that's often so hidden because of the shame involved for everyone. But you've also humanized it for so many of us. You have pictures of, yourself and your mom and your little baby Lisa,
Yeah.
and and you talk about Sambo, and you take us on a journey with you, and it humanizes it. And I think that's so important in these justice conversations, especially around racism and enslaved peoples and forced labor camps. So tell us a little bit more about Freedom Road, some of the work that you do with that. I know it's impacted many, many lives, and you're helping people visit some traumatic things in their history and their DNA and their ancestors. By the way, I think your ancestors would be so proud of you for this work, and I'm just so glad that you're doing it. But then
Thank
also you're
you.
doing that. You're welcome. Fortune would just be so happy for you. But you're also taking people who, non-consciously are working through complicity, whether they know it or not. And that's one of the things I appreciate about you as a friend, and ways you've challenged me as well. But as you walk with this freedom road with people, it's messy, it's not easy. Tell us kind of what you do and what you offer to people.
Well, the main thing, I mean, we exist in order to help folks do justice in more just ways, right? So you have a lot of people who say they want to do justice, but actually they're not doing justice, they're doing charity. Or they say they're doing justice and actually what they're doing is like compassionate ministries or even community development, but it's not necessarily justice. Because justice is when things are as they should be. Justice is when the systems and structures and laws and norms of the way we do life together are as it should be, as they should be. And so, and by should, some people will go, how should it be? How can you know that? Well, I have a faith rooted understanding of how it should be. And it's rooted in my understanding of Genesis 1. Genesis being the first book of the Bible, Genesis 1 being the first page of the Bible. And on that page, the writers were people who were subjugated. They had actually been enslaved for 70 years at the point when they're writing this text. And in this text, what they are doing is they are critiquing the worldview of their oppressors who had told them that for 70 years, 3, 4 generations, that they were created to be enslaved. And, the prevailing thought at the time, I mean, really for thousands of years, especially stemming from the Greeks, but you can go back even further than that, but especially the Greek philosophers, Aristotle especially, and Plato. There was a belief that if you have been conquered, then you have shown that you were created by God to be enslaved, right? That's literally what Aristotle says. He literally says that in his book on politics. And so, when we get to the first page of the Bible, of course, Aristotle's not around, but that is still the worldview of the captors of the Hebrew people, the Babylonians. And it's out of that captivity that the writers of Genesis 1 are writing that text. And so they write and they say, oh, no, 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 no. We're not created to be enslaved. All humanity is created in the image of God. And there's significance to that. We hear that so much that it can feel like a drum beat that has it's like it just becomes a drone in your ear. But there's real significance to that. There had never been a civilization up to that point that had placed the image of God inside all humanity. At that point, when they were writing that, the norm was that the image of God was only placed in the kings and queens, the pharaohs, right? Like the leaders of whole empires. And they were saying, oh, no, 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 no. Each one of us has the value that we would normally ascribe to a king and queen. And that image is in the day, they would have understood the image of the king to be a marker of where that king or queen ruled, of the rule of that. And so that we are created in the image of God and then told to multiply and fill the earth is really we're all supposed to be markers of where God rules, our creator rules. And so the last thing I'll say is that at the moment when they wrote this, they really could have done what all of the civilizations had done up to that point, which is to say, and let us make the priests in the image of God, because the priests at that point were about to enter into their own rule, right, in the temple. And nobody would have been the wiser. But instead of doing that, they democratized power. They threw power out to everyone to have agency. And they actually attached what it means to be human in that text. with the ability to exercise agency, to make choices that impact the world. So there are implications to that for me. I mean, one of the huge implications is that what it means to be human is to be made in the image of God, right? So there is no human on earth that is not divine in their core. Second is that if you are made in the image of God, you are also created by God with the divine call to exercise stewardship of the world, to make choices that impact the world. So, and the third implication is that if that is true, if we are made in the image of God, we're called to exercise stewardship of the world, then when we govern in ways that limit the ability of human beings to exercise stewardship of the world, to make choices, and the fastest ways to do that are through poverty or oppression, then what we are actually doing is we are limiting, crushing, twisting, covering over, and even erasing the image of God on earth. The ancients would have understood that as war against the king, war against God. So when we think about the things that are going on today, in our world, Freedom Road exists to help different groups to engage with the powers that are crushing the ability of the image of God to flourish, to make choices, to have exercise agency. So we do that. We do that by, first and foremost, by story reconciliation. It's our goal to bridge the narrative gap. The gap in the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and what really happened. Because there's no way for us to actually heal the world, to repair what's been broken until we actually face what has happened, what we've done. So we do pilgrimages and we do trainings and we do consulting and coaching for leaders as well. And so we really love that work. That's actually at the heart of what we do. We've been working with a number of different evangelical institutions over the last almost 2 years now, about a year and a half. And those institutions are fabulous. And actually, my little dog is now like nipping at me. So forgive me for being a little bit distracted. This is my niece's dog who is spending the summer with me, and she's literally trying to eat my elbow. So I'm sorry. So I'm like, I'm all twisted in my chair now, trying to avoid her. But the bottom line is that what we do when we do our pilgrimages, what we're doing is we are moving through a story. The story of a people group that has been oppressed, and asking the question of how did it break? When did it break? In order for us to know how it can be repaired. So I'm sorry, I started saying earlier that we were working with a number of different evangelical institutions to do that narrative reconciliation work in their own institutions. They are doing listening projects right now. They are listening to their people and asking, how have we as institutions contributed to the division in our nation, to the division in the church, to misunderstandings of what justice is, and actually even to the normalization of white supremacy.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
all of that's all part of what we do.
It's so beautiful, the work that you do. It's so needed. We need more and more and more of it. And when I think about, I've heard you talk about, Fortune, who's, in your book after, and the connection between the book, The Very Good Gospel, and Fortune to me is your journey. You talked about your faith background, your religious context in which, you found Jesus and then, worked in even a campus ministry for a while. But there was a time where you had to sort of reckon with your understanding of the gospel and what it would have been like to share that with Fortune. How has your understanding of the gospel shifted into what it is today?
Yeah. Wow. Well, when I first went on my very first pilgrimage, it was 2003, and they called it the Shalom Pilgrimage for Reconciliation. And I did not know what shalom meant at all. We had an orientation on shalom, on this biblical concept called shalom, and we started it in Genesis. And I just remember going on the road and looking out the window and just wondering, what is this thing that we're calling shalom? I don't really know what it is. But what I do know is over the course of that summer, I encountered some of the most heinous things that have ever happened on American soil. We traveled through two stories over the course of that summer. The first was the Cherokee Trail of Tears, and the second was the African story in America from slavery through civil rights. And as I got to the end of the summer, after having traveled through these two stories, both of which are part of my own family's story,
Right.
I realized that if I were to go up to my ancestors and I were to tell them my understanding of the good news of the gospel, um, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, but you are sinful and therefore separated from God. And so, but Jesus died to pay the penalty for your sin. So all you need to do is pray this little prayer at the back of the gold booklet, which is this little booklet that had all these little points in it. And then you get to go to heaven if you pray the prayer. I was challenged. Would my third great grandmother, Leah Ballard, would she jump for joy from this news? Would this cause her to jump and shout? And I had to admit, when I was really like gut level, bone level honest with myself, that the answer was no. In fact, it was a hell no,
Mm-hmm.
because if she had been like, I like to joke now that if she was in the 80s, the 1980s, she might have said, "Are you smoking crack?" you know, because do you not see me?
Yeah.
Do you not see my circumstances, my context, my situation here? She had 17 children, 5 of which are nowhere to be found anywhere, but we know that she had them because she told us she had them. They were
Mm.
likely sold
Mm.
from her during enslavement. She lived through the Civil War and tasted, for many years, actually, she tasted freedom, but she lost her first 5 children. And we believe that she might have been a breeder. She might have been forced to breed money for her master, breeding children so that he could sell them away, on a farm, a slave farm in South Carolina. And so, is there a way that she could encounter the gospel and it actually be good news? Well, when I realized that my understanding of the gospel was not going to be received as good news by her, that threw me into depression, which threw
Mm.
me into 13 years of uh, deep analysis of the book of Genesis. And that's where I came to understand this biblical concept of shalom. I just went deeper with it and just did not leave. In fact, it still hasn't left me. I'm still swimming in this biblical
Mm.
concept of shalom now, about 21 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so impactful. I'm also seeing the connection between this and even now the work that you're doing to raise awareness about what's happening with Palestinian people in Gaza. You recently went there on
Mhm.
a trip.
Mhm.
Shalom, the origins are from that area of the world, and that's
Yes,
where the word. It's not
yes.
an English word. So tell us about how shalom is still so much on your mind when you think about Gaza and the situation there.
Well, I mean, when you understand the biblical concept of shalom, you understand that it is about the radical connectedness that we were all created for. We were all created to be connected with all things. We were created to be connected with God, with each other, with the rest of the creation, and also to the systems and structures that govern us. And that connection was created to be not just good, but like Tov Me'od, forcefully good, radically good, in the way that there was blessing and only blessing on the first page of the Bible. No cursing. There was
Mm.
nobody who had need or want. There was truth everywhere. There was reciprocity between all things. There was justice. Things were as they should be. And when God looked around at the end of that, the 7-day epic poem that is that first page, God says, this is Tob Me'od. This is very good. And it's that Tob Me'odness that is shalom. It is the overwhelming wellness of all relatedness. So when we look at Gaza, we have to ask the question, do we have good relatedness there? When we look at the wall, the partition wall, is that good relatedness? Is that when that government decided to place the wall in a way that grabbed land and also separated families from each other, so that they were not able to see each other for like decades. Is that good relations? Good relatedness between human beings, even between nations? If you accept that Israel is and will be, and Palestine is and will be, are these relations between these two people groups something that is truth telling, that is reciprocity, that brings reciprocity, that is as it should be? I would say no. And then you take the reality that, going back to the Nakba, that the way that the nation of Israel was established was done through colonization, through the grabbing of land and the forced removal of people. Um, Palestinian people all over the world still have the key to their house, to the house that they were forced from in 1948. I mean, that says so much. And it says a lot that the idea for that forced removal, and the way that Israel actually did that, it was inspired ultimately by the Native American removals here in America, right? So when we look at how things are, the way that the people are living together, it is not a picture of shalom. It is not. It is not as God would have it. It's not a picture of tov me'od that God calls the very beginning, our relationships in the very beginning. And that is what God wants for us. So I'm not content by saying you must support Israel. No, what I must support is the kingdom, the reign, the way of God. What I must support is the way of the one who demonstrates to us what God would do. And that for me is the person of Jesus in my faith tradition. And Jesus tells us most clearly in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Back for those of you who have a Christian background, you'll know that the Sermon on the Mount is actually the clearest place where we get Jesus's own ethics, how he says we should relate to the world. And what he says is that no, we need to love our enemies, not put a wall up between them. No, we need to love our enemies, not dominate them, not even build empire against them, and
Mm.
certainly not bomb them. That's
Yeah.
the ethics of Jesus. And so now Lancet, the Lancet group, the most highly esteemed scientific group on the planet, has done the numbers. They have run the numbers. And they have said that the numbers that are coming out of Gaza, the Gaza Health Ministry, which are now about 38,000, a little over 38,000, are way too low in terms of the death toll. The
Wow.
Lancet Group now has estimated, because of the work that they did to run the numbers, that now it's about 186,000.
Mm.
186,000 images of God that have been snuffed out as a result of the conflict that has been going on since just over the last 9 months. There are more child amputees in Gaza than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah,
There
even if
are
it stopped now, it would be a tragedy, and it's
Oh
still
my
going.
gosh. In fact, if it stopped now, you would still have, and over the next month, you'd still have you have tens of thousands more, if not hundreds of thousands, maybe even 500,000 people die from starvation, right? So famine is happening there.
Yeah.
It's not in danger, it's happening.
Hmm.
And it's directly because of the policies that were passed in the first week, the second day of this conflict. On October 8th, Netanyahu declared that he was going to shut off all food, water, and electricity. Well, what does that do? First of all,
Yeah.
that's illegal to do.
Right.
Secondly, how can you say you can do that because this is not your land? How are you going to shut off? Well, it is not their land, but they do have control over everything that goes in and everything that goes out. So they
Hmm.
are an occupying force. And they did shut off the water and the food and electricity. And as a result of that, we now have famine.
Yeah.
So policies
It's
matter.
absolutely, policies matter. And
Mhm.
it's messy as US citizens because our government has ties, and it's a very
Mhm.
nuanced conversation. But I'd love to get your thoughts around, as a US citizen, what kind of position and perspective you have on what American citizens can do to be helpful in this case.
The number one thing that we can do is just to continue to place our bodies on the streets in marches, to place our voices on our phones, calling our representatives in national office, our House representatives, our senators, our president, and also our representatives in city and town municipalities, city councils and town municipalities, our mayors, because there are things we can do. The only reason that this conflict has been able to go on as long as it's gone is because we are funding it. The United States of America, your tax dollars are going to kill Hind, the little girl who was shot 130 something times in her car by IDF, who came and literally targeted her car. And she and her brother were the only ones alive in the car at the time, and they shot her 135 times. She was like, what, 9? The little boy who watched his father burn alive, right? These are the people that we are advocating for. People, not just an issue or an idea or a biblical concept. It's for people. So we need to be raising our voices for people whose voices are not being heard. And so we can call. And I mean, one of the ways rather that we can get in the way, and that's what we really need to do, is to get in the way of the money flow and the ammunitions flow that is flowing from America into the state of Israel so that it can execute this war and others. And another way to do that is by calling for divestment. Divestment in our universities, divestment in our schools, divestment in our cities, our city councils. The Philadelphia City Council just recently actually voted to give hundreds of thousands of dollars, send hundreds of thousands of dollars to invest in Israel and munitions actually in the armament of Israel.
Wow.
That's ridiculous. There are 10,000 Palestinians that live in Philadelphia. That means that 10,000 Palestinian tax dollars have gone to kill their own people. That's not right. So we went to the council, to the city council meeting, and we spoke up about that, and we spoke up about the need to honor and protect the humanitarian workers who are there, and to call for a ceasefire. So there are several things we can do. The number one thing we need to do, though, is to call for that ceasefire and call for divestment, the stopping of money flow and ammunitions flow into the state of Israel. And some people call for all ammunitions to stop. I call especially for what they call offensive weapons. In other words, weapons that are used in order to wage war, not weapons of defense
Right.
against others. So, others who would want to, because, yes, they are vulnerable, and nobody's trying to end Israel on its own. We just want peace. We just want the flourishing of all. Another thing we need to call for is for America to abide by international law. We're not supposed to be giving weapons to people and nations that are breaking international law, that are committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and maybe even genocide. That is a breach not only of international law, but our laws. So we need to call our representatives to abide by American law and by international law.
So good. Thank you for giving us those very specific calls to action for any U.S. citizens abroad or here in the United States. These are ways that you can make an impact if this resonates with you at all. And there's a thread here because you and I sit on the Justice Revival Board, and even the conversation around your book Fortune, and even your book on the Very Good Gospel, understanding what Shalom means. Narrative in the U.S. that's still very prevalent. It's American exceptionalism, which people raised in the U.S. with U.S. curriculum would have gotten that, whatever state they're in, that state's version. American citizens raised abroad in international schools didn't get as much of it, but we got some of it. And then some people around the world were taught to revere the U.S. as if everything the U.S. does is to be this savior of the world. We don't, by and large, my experience overseas is that was never true of what most people thought. But I
Mm,
think once Trump got elected, it certainly took a nosedive from what I experienced
mhm.
overseas about how people
Yes.
saw US citizens. But
Yeah.
because we sit on a board together, there's also this narrative that the US has, great human rights for women. And we
Mm.
know, because you and I work in this area very strongly in our Faith for ERA campaign,
Mhm.
the US has still not passed Equal Rights Amendment. We've had Allison McKinney on the podcast talking about it for International
Mhm.
Women's Day. But I'd
Mhm.
love to hear your perspective as somebody who cares so deeply about this issue of women. Why is it that the US still turns away from and ignores the rights of women, even under an administration that it seems like we would have already had this passed?
Right, you would think that under the Biden administration, right, this is a Democratic administration, they say they're all for democracy, and yet there's been absolutely no movement from this administration to push for the ERA. There are many things that they have done and done well, but that is not one of them. And there are other things that they have not done well as well,
Yeah.
Gaza being principal among them. But what I'll say is that when you go back, I'm also like, that all the genealogy work that I did also helped me to understand American history a lot more because my family was there. They were in the middle of it, so I had to understand the context. So one thing that I learned is that, before the Declaration of Independence and the establishment of our Constitution and the first Congress, women actually could vote in many of the colonies, the original colonies. Women could vote. But it was with the establishment of that first Congress that women lost the vote. Did you know that? That blew my mind when I was like, what? What? So yes, women lost the vote. And I think it was New Jersey was the last state to lose where women lost the vote. And that was like in the early 1800s. And since then, and so why would we lose the vote? Well, it's because one of the principal ideas, one of the um, underwriting assumed realities of our quote forefathers was that white men should rule the world. That was an assumed reality, and it came from go back Aristotle and Plato. It just goes right
Yeah.
back to Aristotle and Plato. And so when they thought of who should rule the world, they were trying to keep it so that only white men could rule. In fact, Benjamin Franklin himself said, he argued in 1740 something, it's 46, I think it was, he sent a letter to the crown. This is, of course, before the Declaration of Independence, saying that America should be set aside as a country for white people, to
Oh,
preserve the
gosh.
white race. I am not kidding you. Benjamin Franklin, who, was here. He discovered electricity like blocks from where I live, right? Like it's like not,
Wow.
he literally discovered electricity here in Philadelphia where I live. And, but at the time, he was arguing that this should be for white folk. And then, um, around the time when they had that first Congress, that's also the time when they did the Three-Fifths Compromise, and they said that black people, no, only people who could vote would be white men. Um, they took the vote from white women, and they established in only a few years later in 1797, first the no, 1787, the very first, no, sorry, 1790, the first Immigration Act, where they said the only people who could become naturalized citizens were white men of good character. So women could not
Gosh.
become citizens, right? So they showed their hand in the very beginning, and that's why I go back to the genesis of all things. In order to understand why we're having so many issues right now, you have to understand where and when did the break happen? Well, the break happened in the very beginning of
Mm-hmm.
the establishment of our nation. This nation was created in order to be a white patriarchy. And that is why, starting with the Civil War, that was a turn from where we had been going. That was a point of turning. It was a point of reckoning. It was a point of repentance, actually, for many, because people paid with their lives. Hundreds of thousands of American men from the Union and Confederates died fighting that war, and that war never ended. And that is the war that we are fighting even today. So the justice revival is fighting for the rights of women to be fully realized in America, because they never have been.
Mm.
Never. When we actually did pass the ERA. I mean, it
Yeah.
has been recognized and ratified by enough states now to declare it the law of the land, the last constitutional amendment, right? But we haven't done it. We haven't done it. And why haven't we done it? Because fundamentally, one of the assumptions that lives under the surface, it's an unspoken assumption that lives under the surface in American life, is that the people who should rule are white men. And until
Yeah.
we see that and reckon with that and repent of that as a nation, like openly, it's not going to change. And it's our work at Justice Revival, Freedom Road, all of our work is to bring our nation and the church especially to the place where we reckon and repent.
Yeah. So important. Ignoring it, keeping the stories hidden, banning books, all the things that are happening don't solve the
Mm-hmm.
problem. They just shove it
No.
down, down deep, and we're still left with the realities of what you're saying. And so this work
Well,
is important, bringing it to
let me
light.
s- let me say this one last thing though about this, Lori, is that because you brought up banning books. I mean, there's banning books, there's voter suppression, there's Project 2025, which if you
Yes.
don't know about it,
Terrifying.
you really Google it, because it's not just an idea. It is
Hmm.
actually actionable policies that have people in place to implement them, and who will be put in place if the Republican Party wins any portion of power, whether it's in the executive branch or legislative branch. They've already captured the Supreme Court. Um, if they get this, they will actually they will implement Project 2025. And the whole goal of it is what? To eradicate democracy in America, to create out of this democracy, this experiment, to create an authoritarian, really honestly, a dictatorship. That's really what it's kind of going for. And that is because of the fundamental belief that, what do they believe? They believe that America was created to be ruled by white men, and the women who are their allies. And that's what they're going for. So we have an obligation to follow in the footsteps of the Americans and the people of faith who have been fighting. It is up to us. We must follow in the footsteps of the movements that have come before, that have been faith rooted. Almost all of them have been faith rooted movements that have been pushing for America to be a more perfect union. In other words, yes, we have a great Declaration of Independence. Yes, we have an amazing, I believe, an inspired Constitution, but it is not the Bible. It is fallible. It was written by human beings. And that's the reason we have amendments, is in order to actually make it a more perfect union. And, the most critical amendments in our Constitution are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and the 19th Amendment, because those are the amendments that actually make this a true democracy. Until those amendments passed, it wasn't. It was a kind of an autocracy. It was a kind of it really fashioned more after the model of Europe, where you had nobles and serfs. The only difference up to that point was that the nobles got to be all white men, not just some. But anybody who
Hmm.
wasn't a white man was a serf. The women were serfs. People of African descent were serfs. Immigrants were serfs. Even people who were of Mexican heritage, when Mexico was, before America trounced Mexico, like, they were serfs in their own land, right? So this is who we are. This is who we have been. And in order for us to heal, in order for us to repair what was broken, we must reckon and we must repent.
Absolutely. So well said. I just really appreciate you and the history that you've learned in your own journey, the way you share it with us, the way you give us, you know, the truth. You don't mince words, and we need that. We need a conversation where we're not coddling complicity, where we're not coddling people who have actively treated humans, image bearers of God, God's children,
Mhm.
as less than, as secondary, or worse, not human at all. Those
Mhm.
are not things that we have to coddle. Those are things we speak out against. And I really appreciate that about you. And when I think about all that you're doing, all that you've done, part of me is wondering, what are you working on and kind of what's coming up next for you?
Hmm. Well, let me just say that, I mean, this year is the most consequential year in American history up to this point. We can say that certainly 1861 was a comparable year when the Civil War began, and also we had just elected Lincoln as our to be our president, right? And I think that we are literally in the midst of that kind of a year. I don't know if there'll be a civil war, but we do actually have promises of violence coming from one side of the aisle. And actually, they are declaring war. They are saying that they are in the middle of a war. And so when one side declares war, you're actually in a war, whether you want to be or not. And I think we have to reckon with the reality that that's true. So for us on Freedom Road, we're still kind of figuring out what is our place in the midst of this new reality that we live in. What I will say is that we are ever more committed to those who want to travel the path of repair. We have several different groups that are working with us right now in order to discern how can we work with them in order to help their organizations, evangelical organizations, to do that deep work of truth listening, truth telling, so that they can actually begin to live a new story, not just the story they've lived in the past. We're working right now with the Episcopal Church to help their leaders of color to deal with issues of internalized oppression. And so we're going deeper on that. I'm working with some of our colleagues around the country to help the church to decolonize our understanding of Jesus, to decolonize our understanding of the scripture, which was not and is not a European text. No Europeans wrote the scripture, not one. Not one. And yet, the locus of orthodoxy, the people who have told us and tell us what is true about the scripture for the last 1,000 years, have been located in Europe. Well, why is that? How is that? And how have we gotten some things wrong? Because their interpretations are not seeing the whole picture. They're seeing it through a European lens, not the lens within which it was written. So we're doing that work. And we're also, I think, fundamentally showing up in the spaces where the powers are attempting to crush the image of God. And we are
Yeah.
standing with those who say no, adding our voice to the the great and insurmountable no.
It's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing so much with us today. People all around the world, I'm sure, resonate with this, whether you've ever set foot in the United States or not. These are some global issues going on. The world is big, but it's also small. And in the same way that before I ever met you, Lisa, we ended up having mutual friends before we knew each other. The world's just like that sometimes, and all of our
Yeah.
actions and can impact other people. And whatever country people live in, if they have the chance to vote or speak into their government, it affects other places. And so this conversation is so, so important for whatever people's faith background is and country is that they live in. So I appreciate you bringing this to the conversation. I'd love for you to let our audience know where they can find you and more of your work and your writing. If they wanted to reach out to you and find more about any of it, how could they find you?
Absolutely. Well, hey, just check out lisasharonharper.com. You're going to find pretty much everything that we're doing is all kind of right there. You can also find out more about Freedom Road at freedomroad.us. That's our website, and it's supposed to be US, but we don't say that. We say us because it is larger than the US. And we have a podcast as well. So Freedom Road Podcast is a great space to travel with and kind of come along on that journey of decolonization. So we're walking Freedom Road, and we invite you to join us on that journey. Um, and also, of course, read the books. I mean, if you really want to go deeper into what we were talking about today with Shalom, with the question of repair, and what it will take, just read my last two books, The Very Good Gospel and fortune, how race broke my family and the world, and how to repair it all.
Thank you so much for being here today, Lisa, for the difference you're making, just for our friendship and who you are as a person. I'm just so glad that you could come onto the show today and share who you are with the world.
Thank you, Lori. It's been an honor to be with you.
Well, these conversations we are having on this podcast are ones intended to challenge us and bringing different perspectives to the table, helping people bring their own differences, who they are, and making a difference around the world. I mean, Lisa is such a great example of that. She has shown us both in her books and her writing uh, who her family is, who her ancestors are, all the stories and DNA and history that makes up her as a human being. And she's a wonderful human being, making such a difference in the world and asking us to join her in this work of shalom, right? This Hebrew word that means more than just peace. It's very all encompassing. It's about our relationships with each other, our relationships with the divine, our relationships with the land we live on, and all of this planet. And the interconnectedness of that and the decisions that we make. This world is so big and so small at the same time, where each of our actions can have a reaction somewhere else. We see how even storms can start in Africa, like Hurricane Beryl, and plow through the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, which happened days after my family was in Tulum, Mexico recently, and hit that area, and then went all up into Texas, and now it's causing flooding in Vermont. Our world is connected in so many ways. And so, even if this conversation feels very US centric in some ways, about enslaved peoples here in the United States, the conversation around colonization is a very global conversation. The conversation around decolonizing our religious spaces, the church in particular, and decolonizing our thinking of how structures and systems have been built. And the US and the government here that was established in 1776, having been, in the foundation of it all, as she mentioned, the idea that really it was white men who should be the ones voting and leading in this government. And today we're still feeling that tension, as that foundation that was laid is still very much a part of the story, of the narrative, of the expectation. And so, check out Project 2025 that she mentioned. I know it's been in a lot of my social media and people that I follow, people posting about it and mentioning it, whether are a U.S. citizen here in the U.S. or abroad, or a citizen of any other country. Whoever gets elected here in the United States in November, it will have an impact globally because of the way that the US has been so influential for so many years and continues to be so. And I know people in Europe, they're starting to prepare for what that might look like, because they're taking this seriously too, because world leaders will be affected if Project 2025 is implemented. So please read up on that. Please do not act as though people are hysterical when they bring it up, because it's in a document. It is something people are working toward. And if there's anything I've learned in my experience, where I had a pastor who I ended up working with who was very abusive in a workplace environment, um, and I didn't see it coming. I just don't want us to not see this coming, because there are steps we can take. And although it might be uncomfortable to look into something like Project 2025 or seem that somebody's being hysterical about it, I would just invite you to be curious. Um, Lisa had a moment where she didn't even know what the word shalom meant. She was just raised in a particular faith upbringing that didn't give her that information. And once she heard it, she was curious and wanted to dig into it more. And it took her on a journey. And it's a core of who she is today. And so I think that if there's anything about this community that I want us to be about, it's that we don't look away from uncomfortable things. Maybe that you're overwhelmed and your threshold is, it's you're just flooded right now. And so it's totally absolutely okay and recommended that you don't dig into something when you're feeling overloaded, but that you put it on a list of things you want to get to. And when you feel regulated and you feel that you're at a moment where you could embrace this concept of what is going on with something like Project 2025, or even digging into what is really happening in the nuance of Gaza, that it hopefully is a place where we can get to support where all humans flourish, where that it's not a scarcity mentality, that abundance is an option, and we can all coexist in lands together where we all flourish and we don't deprive one group of something out of fear that we would lose something. And so for Jewish people, Palestinian people, for Arabs, for everybody that lives in the context in the Middle East that we're discussing here on this podcast today, that we come to a solution where it's a win-win, where everybody can thrive and flourish together as human beings, and that we don't have to deprive others of water and electricity and food in order for that to happen. And at the same time, we keep people safe from being, kidnapped by terrorist organizations, that we can hopefully find a solution where everybody can flourish. And I know that it's hard because there's long histories both in the Middle East and in the United States that play into the minds of people, that create narratives in our own minds. And that is what it means to be human. I've talked about this on the podcast before. Being human means we are story making machines. And just like Lisa mentioned, her work with Freedom Road is mostly working on the narratives that have been in people's minds. What have you been told about enslaved peoples? What have you been told about forced labor camps in the South? Um, some people see enslaved labor camps as a plantation. You go and have a nice picnic or have a wedding, and that it's glamorized and it's cute. And it doesn't mean we can't redeem our history and find the good parts of it. But it means if you whitewash something and act like everything was pretty and beautiful when there was darkness and evil, and somebody like in Lisa's family was what we believe was a breeder slave and had 5 children that she was asked to carry against her will, most likely, and that those children were sold. And it was for her to be a money making machine with her own body. And that is just unacceptable for any human being to have to endure. And it doesn't really seem like the kind of place you'd want to have a wedding or a picnic. But it is a place where you want to face the hard truths. And that is not easy. It's not easy for me. It's not easy for anyone, because shame really prevents us from doing the work of digging in. And it's so easy to say, well, it wasn't me. And maybe you don't have ancestors that enslaved people, or out of all of your ancestors, you found one that had one enslaved person, and even that is unacceptable. And so, what can we do now? In light of all of that, how can we have compassion on each other and the narratives people have brought for generations? Like she said, 5 centuries. And people alive today know people in their family that they had conversations with that had been enslaved, that were in the Civil War period, and that's still fresh. It's still new. It's still something we're working out, and it means that we need to have hard conversations, difficult conversations. And I love that about my friend Lisa, is she doesn't shy away from them. She comes at it from a position of wanting us all to have what she envisions of shalom. It's a heaven on earth. It's something so many people walk around assuming it could never happen, or enjoying the privilege that they have, to the extent that they don't want to work to help pass an ERA for women, don't want to work to make sure women get equal pay for equal work, because it feels nice to be a man and enjoy those privileges, and to not recognize that women have their work stolen, their ideas stolen in a meeting, or entire chapters of their book at times stolen, which if you join us in the Patreon conversation in our difference maker community that I have with Lisa, I ask her for herself personally to kind of walk us through her perspective on how often women, especially women of color, have had their ideas and their work stolen. She kind of walks through that with us, something that happened to her very personally. And I really hope that you check that out. It's a very special conversation with her, and she has a lot of insights that are really important, especially in the Christian community, and how that can happen, and sort of what she's observed in her own journey and in the journey of others that she knows. And in the spirit of justice, what that means when she stands up for herself and her own intellectual property, and then by default stands up for so many others when she does that. It's not something she spends a lot of time doing, but it is something that she, don't cross that boundary, and you shouldn't cross it with anyone. And so I think the more we recognize and hear the stories of each other and what people have walked through, the more we can just have compassion. We don't often realize what people are walking through, what their ancestors have had to endure from the Middle Passage and the evil hell that was, that her ancestor somehow survived, or even just the journey from one state to another, being in Kentucky and having to flee through Indiana when even that was a northern state, and walking through passages where Southerners had migrated up there because of what was going on economically in the South. And so, even though it was a northern state, still having to interact with some Southerners who had really didn't consider her ancestors to be people that were worthy of treating with human dignity and respect, and just all that that journey would have meant in a quote unquote separate but equal, which was not actually ever equal, situation where there were drinking fountains that were separate, and bathrooms and restaurants and that kind of thing, and schools. So knowing people have walked through such a journey, I love the title Freedom Road. I hope that we can all join on that journey in whatever form. So if that is something that really resonates with you, or you're curious at all about it, please check out Lisa's website. We're going to link her website in the show notes. And like she said, freedomroad.us, that you're included in that, whoever you are. Please support her and her work. It's very, very hard, but beautiful. And she is not only smart and very knowledgeable, because she's done the hard work to be that, but she's also driven with such a passion for seeing everyone flourish. And I love that about her. And it's something that has really challenged me to be more that way in more areas of my life. So I know that you'll enjoy being somebody who reads her work and follows her podcast, and really maybe even invite her into consult with a space that you're in. The work that she does is absolutely beautiful, and taking us all on a journey to a better place where we can experience heaven on earth, a shalom, instead of hell on earth that we're seeing in so many places. We all deserve to flourish and thrive, and that takes all of us working together, shoulder to shoulder. And she's in it with us in a very, very, very passionate and justice oriented way. So glad she could be on the show today. Thank you for hanging in there with us. I know many of you are doing similar work around the world in various capacities. And so, yeah, look forward to any collaborations that might come out of this between you and Lisa, and the way we're all trying to make a difference in the world. And take care of yourselves. Make sure you're getting some rest and recovery, because I know many of you work so hard. So practice that self-care. And as always, keep making a difference wherever you are.